Those of you who are used to me teaching know that I always begin my classes the same way. Grace, mercy, and peace to you from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ. I've adopted that some time ago, and it makes me feel differently about you when I stand up in front of you. So if it doesn't please you, it still pleases me to be able to say that. Tonight we're going to be talking, I'm calling it the focus of our benevolence. There was a slightly different title at the beginning, but I've kind of expanded the study to a little bit broader view than I originally planned, so I've kind of changed the title a bit. We're going to talk about benevolence. Benevolence, the word actually comes from two Latin words. One is bene, B-E-N-E, which means good or fine. In fact, in Italian, that still means good or fine. And the word, it's pronounced, I guess, volens. It's a V, so we would say volens. But in Latin, they pronounce the V as a W, which is not important to us. So it means, and volens means wishes. So it means good wishes or good will. Now, that doesn't really tell the full story, though, does it? Because you can have good wishes and goodwill towards someone and do absolutely nothing. In fact, we're going to find out here in a minute that that's absolutely wrong. So benevolence is not just good wishes or goodwill, it's the practice of doing something as a result of good wishes or goodwill. So it's not just the idea of feeling benevolent toward a person, it's an action that is actually carried out. And we will see that the scriptures support this strongly later. I've kind of thought about this a bit, and you can divide benevolence into at least three categories. I mean, we could slice it many different ways, but I decided to divide it between physical, emotional, and spiritual benevolence. The physical side is the one we usually think of. You know, a person needs food, clothes, shelter, you know, that kind of thing, or money is needed for something. That's usually a physical need of some sort. Used to, in the early days, basically the early Christians took care of food needs of their members and others. And that's about all they really needed, because you know, you had one set of clothes and you had a lean-to to get under to get out of the rain, and so food was about it. But nowadays, you know, a physical need is kind of like food, clothing, shelter. Medical is kind of a need now because doctors don't kill you like they used to. Sometimes you get well when you go to see a doctor. Transportation, because people don't walk everywhere now like they used to. Even communication is almost a necessity now. Education, counseling can be a physical need. As an example of that, Tyra and I are probably just slightly above average in the area of finance and money management and investing and things like that. And so sometimes we offer what little we know to other people as a way of helping them manage their own finances better. That's a physical need, but the benevolence is us using what little bit of skill we have and our time to help those people understand how to manage money or how to invest or how to open a stock account or, you know, any kind of things like that. You don't usually think of something like that as benevolence, but your time is also a benevolent gift, isn't it? When you give of your time. So education, counseling, work is a need. People say, well, I don't want to work. Well, you need to. Work is good for you, both physically and emotional. Exercise is a need. And I guess nowadays we'd have to include entertainment as a need that people have. Some of those are less needful than other things, but certainly food, clothing, and shelter are physical needs that people need in order to survive. And if they don't have the ability to provide that for themselves, the benevolence of others is what would provide that for them. Emotional benevolence is a little harder to define sometimes. In fact, emotional benevolence is one of the strongest reasons that we meet together here. In fact, Curtis is going to talk about the purpose of assembly. When's that coming up? In the near future, right. And one of the things that you get or should get as a result of meeting here is emotional benevolence from others, and give emotional benevolence like encouragement, building up a person's self-esteem and self-image, their self-worth, giving and receiving kindness, the feeling of belonging and being accepted. These are all things that people need. Having relationships and friends, love. And again, we can go right back to that counseling thing. A lot of people need heavy emotional counseling. Sometimes they don't know it, but they need, relationship counseling. They need all kinds of counseling. So that's a need also. And then we have the third one, spiritual counsel, spiritual benevolence. And that can be, it can be receiving teaching, could be a benevolent act, or giving teaching as a benevolent act. Being a missionary could be a benevolent act. Going to a foreign country or starting a church somewhere or whatever. Doing, teaching, helping a person increase their faith, helping them grow spiritually. Again, we're back to counseling again, can also occur because some people need spiritual counseling. So it looks like counseling can occur in all three of those. Basically, education and knowledge can be used as a benevolent gift. So not all benevolence has to be physical, even though we usually think that way. The first thing that comes to mind is somebody needs money to buy food or clothes or whatever. And one of our benevolent programs here, actually two of them, has to do with feeding people and clothing people. And those mostly go out of the church to people of the community. And we're going to talk about that a little bit in a minute. And by the way, I support those very, very strongly, so don't get the wrong idea that I'm going to say that's not a good thing. And this benevolence can go to your immediate family. It can go to your extended family, like your cousins and uncles and aunts and relatives and grandmother and people like that. It can go into the local area where you live. It can go into the regional area where you live. It can even nowadays even go internationally. And even in Paul's time, they could do international benevolence because they were able to travel quite large areas. We haven't quite made interplanetary yet, but I suspect one day it'll be possible to do interplanetary benevolence. We will either send aid to, or people on Mars will send aid to us because they're better off than we are. But one day we may even be doing interplanetary benevolence. Intergalactic's probably a long way off right now, I think. So people have these needs, and you need resources to meet those needs. They all require usually a combination of things to meet a need. For example, time is required quite often. Effort on your part is required quite often. Skill, a person's ability to do something, or like if someone needs electrical work done, you have to have some kind of skill in electrical work to do that. You can't just go, oh, I can fix that, and you've never even looked at an electric socket. You'll get hurt if you do that. But yes, dear. No, go ahead. I'm happy.
That an important thing of benevolence is that sometimes people just need someone to listen.
That's another of the emotional/spiritual needs. I'm glad you brought that up. In fact, if you think of others, by all means, bring them up. Sometimes, and I don't want to sound sexist here, but women quite often just need somebody to listen. They don't want a solution, guys. They just want you to hear them talk.
And I would say, here, listening without judging.
Okay, listening without judging. Just listening. And see, guys, we want to fix the problem. What'd you say? Or interrupt you, yeah. Don't interrupt. Just sit there with your mouth shut and listen and go, oh, you poor thing. That's all you need to do. Because they really don't want a solution most of the time. They just want you to hear them. Now, guys, we're a little different than that. If we complain, we want a solution, But anyway, so listening to a person just blow off steam or tell you their troubles and things like that, that's one of the hardest benevolent acts I can think of is to just sit and listen without saying or doing anything. I find that very difficult to do. Okay, good point. So we may need skills of some sort, we need time, we need effort, and almost always money's involved in a lot of, certainly the physical benevolent activities that we do. The more spiritual, emotional ones might not involve money. So there is that. And for an opportunity to come about, you need these resources, and you need a need and a time and a place. So a person has to have a need at a specific time in a specific place, and you have to have the resources. Otherwise, nothing happens of any value. So all of these things have to come together at the same time. In fact, if you don't have the in fact, there's the last one. You have to have the willingness to take action on top of all this other stuff, and we'll see in a moment, again, why that's so important for that sort of thing. So we've got all these needs out here, and basically benevolence is filling a need, physical, emotional, or spiritual, that a person has that they can't fill for themselves. If I can fill it myself, I don't need your help. And so it's something I need your help with. It's hard for me to be a friend to myself. I tried, and I don't like me, so it doesn't work very well. So, I need you to be kind and friendly to me. People say, well, I'm being kind to myself. That's not what we're talking about here. So anyway, a person has needs. Okay, next question is, who are we to be benevolent towards? It sounds like an easy question, doesn't it, to answer? Who should we be benevolent toward? Galatians 6, 9, and 10. The first part of it is not exactly what we're looking for, but I thought I would use it for context. It says, "Let us not become weary in doing good, for at the proper time we will reap a harvest if we do not give up." And then the next verse says, "Therefore, as we have opportunity, let us do good to all people." That's not the end of the verse. Let us do good to all people, especially to those who belong to the family of believers. And the family of believers is, the literal translation would be to the household of faith. That would be the more literal translation. Now this raises an interesting question. What does especially mean? What does especially mean?
Give preference.
Give preference to, the better part of, the majority, the greater interest or concern to, especially those of the household of faith or of the family of believers. Do we usually think that way? Usually not. Usually benevolence tends to be thought of as going outward. Like the food program and the clothing program. They tend to serve people in the community. Nothing wrong with that, okay? Because it says, let us do good to all people. And that is doing that, is it not? But notice it says, especially to those who belong to the family of believers. Now that's the last slide. I have much more to say, but that's my last slide. I'm going to leave that slide right there for the rest of the talk. Especially those who are the family of believers. That's a big word. Let's see how that was actually implemented. And I'm going to do that in just a second. But some people would say, well, that's not fair. Why should members of the family get preferential, or get the lion's share, let's say, of our benevolence? In fact, I had when I said this to someone several years ago, they said, that's not fair. Not fair. What would be fair? To make it random to anyone without giving any preference at all to your family? Would you do that with your children and their food? Would you take food out of your children's mouths to give to someone else? Would you do that? I hope not. If you have excess food, you would feed your children and you might feed someone else, but wouldn't you feed your children first? Would you not clothe your children first and family? Would you not send your children to school before you sent someone else, paid for someone else to go to school? That's preferential treatment, isn't it? Why would you do that? Because they're family. And this is family in a very real sense. Those who are in the family of believers. So, not fair. Let me give you an example here. We have limits on our resources. We don't have infinite resources. If we had $6.5 billion and we wanted to be infinitely fair, we could give every person in the entire world $1. How much good would that do? It would buy a piece of a meal in some places and maybe a whole meal in other places once. That's not going to do much of anything, is it? $6.5 billion would not accomplish anything, really. And it might have some unintended consequences that were not pleasant at all. You just never know for sure. But if you had a fairly large amount of money, rather than diluting it completely, why not rifle shot it to a smaller group of people that you can actually make a difference for? Because you truly can't take care of the entire world, can you? It's impossible. So you have to make decisions as to who you will give your benevolence to. Yes, sir?
It costs as much to go and distribute that $1 to everybody in the world as you've got to give out.
It really will. It costs a fortune just to distribute it. Of course, we live in the electronic age now, so we can distribute it to everybody electronically. But assuming, of course, they have a computer and a computer account.
2/3 of those people don't even have electricity.
Don't even have electricity, so they wouldn't know what to do. That's a good observation. But the truth is, you will never be able to meet all benevolent needs. Never. So thinking that, focusing more on your brothers and sisters and other believers that may not be where you are, but who are believers, focusing more on those people makes perfect sense. And I'm going to hit some scriptures here in a minute that really zero in on that. There are a few kinds of benevolence, though, that you can do that basically don't cost you hardly anything. And that's like being kind wherever you go and to set an example wherever you go and whoever you meet. That's easy, or should be easy. Of course, if you're not a very good example and you're not a kind person, that's going to be difficult for you. But if you want to, you can do that all day long, every day, by just living a proper life in front of people so that they have something to look at and being kind to people. That's benevolence. That meets emotional needs, and it may even meet spiritual needs, mightn't it? You can do that. Anybody can do that. You don't even have to have any special skills. Just do that. Okay. So let's look at some specific scripture examples and see how this comes up in other scriptures. If we look in Matthew 25, there's a very familiar story about the sheep and the goats when Jesus says when he comes into his kingdom, he'll divide the two groups of people. And it says, "Then the king will say to those on the right, 'Come, you who are blessed by my Father, take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world.'" And then he goes through, I was hungry, you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, you invited me in and needed clothes. You clothed me, I was sick. You looked after me, I was in prison, you came to me. Then the righteous will answer him, "Lord, when did we see you like that?" I just shortened it. It says, the king will reply, Truly, I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these, my brothers and sisters, you did it to me. He didn't say to one of the least persons or these. It actually uses a single word that can be translated brothers and sisters. It says, typically it gets translated one of the least of these, my brothers. But it has the meaning of both. Now, it's easy for us to go, wait a minute. Who's my brother? Well, how about the Good Samaritan? That was neighbor. Different. Neighbor is not brother. Let's find out what Jesus says about who is my brother. Matthew 12, 46 through 50. It's also in Mark 3 and Luke 8, so apparently it's pretty important because it's in all three Gospels. It says, while Jesus was still talking to the crowd, his mother and brothers stood outside wanting to speak to him. Someone told him, your mother and brothers are standing outside wanting to speak to you. He replied to him, who is my mother and who are my brothers? Most people would go, you're crazy. They're right out there. Pointing to his disciples, he said, here are my mother and my brothers. For whoever does the will of my Father in heaven is my brother and sister and mother. So when he says brothers and sisters, he's talking about believers, people who do the will of God. Those are his brothers and sisters, not everybody. So people who are not believers are not your brothers and sisters. They might be your neighbor, but they're not your brothers and sisters. So in this previous thing, he says, I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me. Pretty clear, isn't it? Now, that doesn't mean that they couldn't have done it for other people too, but he focuses in on what you did for other brothers and sisters. Now, let's look at the flip side of that. A few verses later, he turns to those on the left and he says, depart from me. And he goes through, I was hungry, I was thirsty, a stranger, I needed clothes, I was sick, I was in prison, and you didn't do anything for me. And they go, when did that happen? We didn't see you. And he says, whatever you did not do for one of the least of these, you did not do for me. In other words, you didn't do it for anybody. You didn't do it for my brothers and sisters, and you didn't do it for anybody else either. That's not a very good person, is it? No kindness at all in their hearts for these simple little things that he mentions. And these are just examples. These are not the only kinds of benevolence that people can do. But he's looking for kind-hearted, giving people here. These people not only didn't do it to the brothers and sisters, they didn't do it to anybody. First case, he says, as you did it unto the least of one of these, my brothers and sisters. In the second case, you didn't do it to the least of anybody. Nobody. Big difference. Let's look at Romans 12, verse 12 through 14. Be joyful in hope, patient in affliction, faithful in prayer. Share with the Lord's people who are in need. Practice hospitality. Why didn't he just say share with people in need? That would have been a perfectly good statement, wouldn't it? Just share with others. He says share. The actual word there is the saints. Share with the saints who are in need. The sanctified ones, the holy ones, the believers. He says share with the Lord's people who are in need. Now this next one you're going to be very familiar with, James 2, 14 through 16. What good is, and this is what explains the willingness to do something versus just the good feelings toward people. What good is it, my brothers and sisters, if someone claims to have faith but has no deeds? Can such faith save them? Suppose, now here it comes, a brother or a sister. It doesn't say someone. It says a brother or sister. Again, this doesn't mean it can't be just someone, but they're focusing on the brothers and sisters, the family of God. Suppose a brother or a sister is without clothes and daily food. If one of you says to them, go in peace, keep warm and be well fed, but does nothing about their physical needs, what good is it? So two things here. He's focusing on the family of God, and he's focusing on action, not just goodwill. And we do this sometimes. We focus on goodwill and think we've done something. Feeling good toward someone doesn't necessarily meet the need. Unless, of course, they just need someone to feel good toward them, which can sometimes fill a need, right? Depending on what the need is. There is that. Again, brother or sister, the Lord's people. Least of these, my brethren, brothers and sisters. 1 John 3:17 and 18 is very similar to this James verse. It says, this is how we know what love is. Jesus Christ laid down His life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for our brothers and sisters. If anyone has material possessions and sees a brother or sister in need but has no pity on them, how can the love of God be in that person? Dear children, let us not love with words or speech, but with actions and in truth. Again, I don't think he means you don't provide benevolence to non-Christians, but notice the focus. Every time, brothers and sisters, saints, those who are in the family of God, over and over and over again. Hebrews 6:10, God is not unjust. He will not forget your work and the love you have shown Him as you have helped His people and continue to help them. Keeps coming up, doesn't it? So, what should our benevolence, priorities, and actions look like? So, let's start as tight in as we can start, and that would be immediate family. Of course you have to be benevolent toward your family. 1 Timothy 5:4, 8, and 16. This entire section actually talks about a whole concept of taking care of widows within the church and how to do that. It's a very long section on how to minister to the widows in the church. And this was difficult at that time more so than it is today because widows basically were destitute for the most part if they didn't have someone to sponsor them or to look after them. So it talks about that. And verse 4 says, but if a widow has children or grandchildren, these children or grandchildren should learn first of all to put their religion into practice by caring for their own family. And so repaying their parents and grandparents, for this is pleasing to God. Anyone who does not, this is verse 8, anyone who does not provide for their relatives and especially for their own household, your children, your spouse, that kind of thing, has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. The King James says worse than an infidel, someone who is not faithful to God. Verse 16. This one's a little odd because it's got a strange reference to it. It says, if any woman, I'm going to say if any one, who is a believer has widows in their care, they should continue to help them and not let the church be burdened with them so that the church can help those widows who are really in need. The actual wording here says if any woman who is a believer has widows in her care, she should continue to help them and not let the church be burdened. I'm not sure why it says woman there, but nevertheless it does. So essentially what it says is take care of your family. Do that first. Take care of your family and your extended family, your parents and your grandparents and maybe some cousins and uncles and things like that. You may have to take care of some people. Look after your family. And it's more than just your immediate family. You have a pretty big family sometimes. Look after them. Because if you don't, if you're unwilling to do that, you're worse than an unbeliever, he says. That's pretty tough language. So at the lowest level, we have to be interested in and willing to take care of our own family. Now, it's entirely possible one may not be able to, okay? That's always a possibility. But if you have the resources to do it and don't do it, you're worse than an unbeliever. You're a bad person. Take care of your family. Now, sometimes, Curtis, I'm not speaking to you because your children grew up okay. Sometimes ministers and missionaries and people who are heavily involved in ministry don't do this. They provide physical needs, food, clothing, shelter, but they spend so much time doing the work of God that they neglect the emotional and spiritual needs of their own children and spouse. There is a technical psychological term for this. It's called the preacher's kid syndrome. Now, you can be a preacher's kid and not have the syndrome. but the preacher's kid syndrome is a real syndrome where the kid grows up maladjusted because dad was out here doing ministry and forgot that his number one ministry was to his children. It happens. Your number one benevolence and ministry is to your own family. When you have done all you can do there, now, or if you are doing all you can do there, now you can step out to the next level. Yes. Sure, go ahead.
Any distinction between helping people who really need help versus helping people who are in the position they're in because of their own mistakes?
Okay, you may not have heard that. He's talking about helping people who are really in need. Of course, the other person is really in need too. But he said, a person who's in need, but what about the person who is in need because of their own fault? Okay, let me give an example. How about a person who is trying to recover from drug addiction? That's their fault. I mean, nobody forced them to take the drugs, at least we presume that. And there's a good chance they will never completely recover. Do we just abandon them?
Circumstance.
That's an important point. It doesn't matter how they got there. Now, if they are continuing to do a behavior that, they're always in need of money. Why are they always in need of money? Because they play the horses. Okay, something's going to have to be done about that. You can't just keep giving them money so they can keep going and playing the horses or gambling or doing whatever. So you have to work with that. Now, this is one of the reasons I think that they talk so much about working within the family rather than just on the street, because you're much more likely to know, aren't you? If I know you and you come to me and say, Joe, I need help. I got a problem. I'm much more likely to know. Or if I don't know, I can go to someone that does know you quite well. Is this really true? Yeah, he really does have problems in this area. He needs some help, And then I can be more confident that my benevolence is actually real benevolence, can I? And that it might even have some value. If it doesn't have value, I still get the blessing. That's another side of benevolence, by the way. Say it again.
Is giving someone money always being benevolent?
Is giving someone money always being benevolent? Absolutely not. Money isn't always the answer. Sometimes you need to not give them money and give them what the money's supposed to buy. I used to go back and forth out to Santa Fe, New Mexico a lot, and I would go into these restaurants in Santa Fe on the weekend. I ate in my hotel room during the week, but I would go into a restaurant in Santa Fe during the weekend, and quite often there would be a person there at the door asking for money for food. And my usual response was, come on in with me, and I will feed you till you explode and buy you a sack of food to take with you. And sometimes they would do it. Those people actually wanted food. I mean, and we always wonder, what are they going to use the money for if I give it to them? This person actually wanted food. He came in, he started ordering. He didn't order as much as I thought he should. I said, order more. Get yourself plenty of food. Have a little hamburger and a small fry and a small Coke. I said, get a big hamburger, big French fries, an apple pie, a Coke, and an ice cream. Okay, this guy was being conservative because he didn't feel like he could do that. So I said, I'll feed you. And then I said, now go buy a sack of hamburgers and take them with you. Okay, that worked. I didn't give him money. I actually gave him food. Had another case where I was going into a restaurant, and a man about my age at the time, in his 40s. I'm a little older than that now. Just a little. 60s, almost 70. I was going into this restaurant. He was probably in his mid-40s, and he says, I need money for food. I said, come on in. My usual response, come on in, I'll feed you till you explode. And he says, well, my wife's up the street in the car. I said, well, go get her, bring her down here, and I'll feed her till she explodes too. You know, because if you're hungry, I guess she is too. He just walked off, you know, because he didn't want the money for food. He wanted it for something else. So you don't always give money. And in fact, I recommend that you tend not to give money unless you absolutely know where it's going and what purpose it's going to. There's another reason for doing it in the family. You're more likely to have it go in the direction it's supposed to go. No guarantees, but you're more likely for that to work for you if you do that within the family.
Joe, within that brings up a point is that we're to be good stewards in everything that we do.
In everything.
That includes our benevolence.
Good stewards, that's right. You don't want to just throw your benevolence out there. It occurred to me that someone said, well, what about the parable of the sower? Okay, the farmer had no intent whatsoever to throw any of that seed onto anything but good ground. Any seed that went somewhere other than good ground was an accident. So you can't use that as an argument for just scattering your benevolence all over heaven's creation, you know, to whomever. He had no intent at all for any of that seed to go in among the rocky ground or the thorny ground or the shallow, hard clay. He wanted it all to go into the soft, well-cultivated ground. All of it. But he made mistakes as he scattered it. And you're going to do that too. But you should focus on good ground.
Question, and this was just me thinking.
You have questions sometimes that aren't you thinking?
Lots of times.
Oh, okay. I do that all the time. I'm just curious.
In the New Testament, there are two commands that are repeated a number of times.
Okay.
One is to love God, and the other is not to love your brother, your sister. It's to love who?
It's to love your neighbor as yourself.
Who would be neighbor in that instance?
Okay. The Good Samaritan story has value. In fact, that's the question that was asked. And who is my neighbor? And Jesus tells that story. And again, that's not to say that those are the only people, you know, just anybody. I mean, if you have the resources to meet a need for anyone and you feel so inclined, go for it. But, excuse me, I can't help everybody. I don't have enough money, I don't have enough time, I don't have enough skill to help everybody that crosses my path. So I have to decide. I mean, that's a hard fact. If you gave money to everybody that sent you something in the mail asking for money, you'd be out of money real fast. Real fast. And some of them are very good charities like St. Jude's Hospital. I mean, that's a great thing. But my money goes somewhere else. I don't give to St. Jude's Hospital. Other people think that's a great thing and they give to that. I think it's a great thing too. I don't give to it though, because that's not one of the things that my heart goes after. So we're balancing here. You want to do good to everybody. Let us do good to all people. That's the general rule. But especially to those who are in the family of believers, which first of all includes your family, hopefully. Then it comes out. By the way, I want to give one more. We're going to run out of time here. I want to give one more verse here. Mark 7:19 through 13. He talks about, Jesus is talking to these people. He said, you have a fine way of setting aside the commands of God in order to observe your own traditions. For Moses said, honor your father and mother, and anyone who curses their father or mother is to be put to death. But you say that if anyone declares that what might have been used to help their father or mother is korban, that is devoted to God, then you no longer let them do anything for their father or mother. Thus you nullify the Word of God by your tradition that you have handed down, and you do many things like that. So even the Jews at that time would say, okay, what you would have gotten from me, Mom and Dad, I have given it to God. And what really was happening is they weren't giving it to anybody. And I'll give this little gift over here, and I don't have to take care of you because what I would have given you, I have devoted to God. Jesus says, that's just wrong. It's just wrong. Take care of your family. Okay, your local congregation, Acts 2, 44 and 45. And this is a little more than our culture and society can actually handle. But in their culture and society, it worked at that level, and it's not likely to happen exactly that way anymore, but something roughly approximating this. It says, all the believers were together and had everything in common. They sold property and possessions to give to, it says, anyone who had need. I think it's pretty clear they were doing it to the believers. It doesn't exactly say that, but later on it will say that. Acts 4, 32 and 35. All the believers were one in heart and mind. No one claimed that any of their possessions was their own, but they shared everything they had among themselves. With great power, the apostles continued to testify to the resurrection of the Lord Jesus, and God's grace was so powerfully at work in them all that there were no needy persons among them. So there's the proof that they were doing it within the family. From time to time, those who owned land or houses sold them, brought the money from the sales, and put it at the apostles' feet, and it was distributed to anyone, again, among them who had need. Then, Acts 6, 1 through 4, in those days when the number of disciples was increasing, the Hellenistic Jews among them, it actually uses the word, complained against the Hebraic Jews, two different kinds of Jews here, because their widows were being overlooked in the daily distribution of food. And this is where we have the case of the 7 deacons being appointed to take care of the daily distribution of food to the widows in the church there. And there is the extended widows discussion that I mentioned earlier in 1 Timothy 5, which we won't go back again into. To the congregation, 2 Corinthians 16, 15, and 16. You know that the household of Stephanas were the first converts in Achaia, and they have devoted themselves to the service of the Lord's people. I'm presuming that's mostly locally. I urge you, brothers and sisters, to submit to such people and to everyone who joins in the work and labors at it. Service to the Lord's people. Again, it's okay to be benevolent toward outsiders, but they focus very, very strongly on the Lord's people. What about other believers everywhere? Acts 11, 25 through 30. Then Barnabas went to Tarsus to look for Saul, and when he found him, he brought him to Antioch. So for a whole year, Barnabas and Saul met with the church and taught great numbers of people. The disciples were called Christians first at Antioch. I just had to read that part because it's so classic. Called Christians first at Antioch. During this time, here's the part I really want. During this time, some prophets came down from Jerusalem to Antioch. One of them, named Agabus, stood up and through the Spirit predicted that a severe famine would spread over the entire Roman world. This happened during the reign of Claudius, and it did. The disciples, as each one was able, decided to provide help for everybody. No. They decided to provide help for the brothers and sisters living in Judea. This they did, sending their gift to the elders in Judea by Barnabas and Saul. This famine was widespread. It wasn't just the members of the church that were going to be hungry, but they said they were going to help the brothers and sisters living in Judea. Why didn't they help everybody? Because they didn't have $6.5 billion. If you can't feed everybody in Judea, it's impossible. So you got to choose who you're going to feed. Family? I hope so. Shouldn't you choose family over others? 1 Corinthians 16, 1 through 4. Now, about the collection for the Lord's people. Not the general collection, but the collection for the Lord's people. Do what I told the Galatian churches to do on the first day of every week. This is our scripture for laying by in store. On the first day of every week, each of you should set aside a sum of money in keeping with your income, saving it up. See, they don't actually give it every week. They just set it aside and hold it. So that when I come, no collections will have to be made. Then when I arrive, I will give letters of introduction to the men you approve and send them with your gift to Jerusalem. They were taking up money. We're going to find out later. He mentions this over and over and over again in several places. They were taking up money for the poor saints in Jerusalem, for the poor members of the church in Jerusalem. Not for poor people, but poor members of the church. 2 Corinthians 8, 1 through 4. And now, brothers and sisters, we want you to know about the grace that God has given the Macedonian churches. In the midst of a very severe trial, their overflowing joy and their extreme poverty welled up in rich generosity. For I testify that they gave as much as they were able and even beyond their ability. Entirely on their own, they urgently pleaded with us for the privilege of sharing in this, here it comes, service to the Lord's people, or service to the saints, is what it says. 2 Corinthians 9, verses 1 and 2, and verse 12. There is no need for me to write to you about the service to the Lord's people, for I know your eagerness to help. And I've been boasting about it to the Macedonians. See, he's telling everybody back and forth around to each other, telling them that since last year you and Achaia were ready to give, and your enthusiasm has stirred most of them to action. This service that you perform is not only supplying the needs of the, guess who? Lord's people, but also overflowing in many expressions of thanks to God. Again, we don't ignore other people, but our focus is like a laser, in the Scriptures certainly, on who gets the majority of our benevolence, the Lord's people. Romans 15, verse 25 and 26, same contribution going on here. Now, however, I am on my way to Jerusalem, guess what? In the service of the Lord's people there. For Macedonia and Achaia were pleased to make, he's talking about the things I just discussed, were pleased to make a contribution for the poor among the Lord's people in Jerusalem. Again, not the Lord's people everywhere in the world, and not people everywhere in Jerusalem, but the Lord's people in Jerusalem. They focused in on something they could do for the Lord's people in a specific place. They didn't have enough money to give it to everybody, so they focused. And our first focus should be on family, 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 family. First. Now, let's just quickly look at, let's see how many more pages I've got here, just a few. So hopefully I can get it done before it's too late. Think about Nicaragua for a minute. That one is like a triple whammy. We are providing benevolence to our young people who are going there. Physical benevolence, contributions. We are paying part of their cost to go there, and we're sending them with our goodwill and our emotional and spiritual support. So they're deriving something. They're going to Nicaragua to help, I believe it's a Christian organization, isn't it, down there? And they are, working with quite a few believers down there, and there may be some non-believers that get involved in it, but they're basically working with believers down there. So the believers down there are profiting physically and emotionally and spiritually, and guess what's happening to the people who went down there? They're profiting emotionally and spiritually, and they are really profiting spiritually in many occasions. And it's a constant circle. It just goes round and round and round. Everybody is profiting from that. So that's like a triple whammy of doing the right thing here. I used to not think that was all that great, and then I got to thinking about it and said, no, everybody wins for that one, So Nicaragua is a good example of a triple whammy of benevolence. Let's ask the question, based on this teaching, remember the earthquake in Haiti killed 250,000 people. It was horrible. Based on this teaching, how should our Haiti earthquake assistance have looked? It kind of looked right. How should it have looked? We sent goods and money, I guess, to Haiti for the survivors of the earthquake. it went to a Christian organization, right? If I'm not mistaken. It went to a Christian, is that right, John? Okay. It went to a Christian organization. Now, hopefully, they distributed those goods and services mostly to believers. People go, again, that's not fair. Yeah, it is. You can't take care of everybody in Haiti, so you've got to decide who you're going to take care of. And if they didn't, they should have started with believers, and then when they took care of the believers, then they could expand beyond that. There are good reasons, very good reasons, why we should do that. Oh, by the way, I have expanded all the way out to believers all over the world at this point. How about all others, people who are not believers? Now, this is odd. I wrote this out. Strangely, there's virtually no specific guidance on benevolence toward non-believers, except that right there. That's the only thing I could really find. There may be one or two more out there that I just didn't notice, but that's the only one that's a clear statement of how we should treat non-believers benevolently. It's the only one. Did what? It's a big statement, yes, but at the same time, it's modified strongly by where our laser focus should go. So I couldn't really find anything out there other than that statement. And we certainly should be benevolent toward everyone, but we can't take care of the needs of everyone. And above all, we should especially be benevolent to those who belong to the family of believers. Okay, what's the result of doing this? John 13:34 says, "A new command I give to you, love one another, and as I have loved you, so you must love one another. By this everyone will know that you are my disciples if you love one another." Question: how would anybody know that we loved one another? I love you, I love you, I love you, I love you. No, that's not going to work, is it? They're going to, he's an idiot. How would they know that we loved one another? How we treat each other, and what would that consist of? What does it mean to treat someone well? To give them respect. Okay, that's an emotional need. To take care of their physical needs, to take care of their emotional needs, and take care of their spiritual needs. To be a family. And people would look at us and they would go, whoa, those people do okay. Nobody over there goes hungry or without food or without clothes, or they all have a place to live. They get taken care of. They may not have, an upper middle class living, but they get basic needs taken care of when necessary. And some people go, I want to get in on that. Now, they might come in for the wrong reason, but hopefully they would stay for the right reason. However, just because a person walks through that front door doesn't mean they're a believer. So, you don't automatically get into the into the cycle of everybody taking care of your needs just because you walk through the door. But once you become a member of the family, that kind of becomes a part of the understanding. But that's how people know that we love one another, is because we look after one another and take care of one another, and we treat each other well. So they will be drawn by our love. But
to our neighbors,
not on the same level. Same thing, but not to the same degree.
what about with God, our love to God?
Well, of course, your love to God is as much as you can possibly do.
It says you're supposed to do the same kind of love.
No. Love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and body. And love your neighbor as what? As yourself. Totally different. You love God with every fiber of your being and your spirit, if you can. You love your neighbor as if you were taking care of yourself. But again, you can't take care of everybody. So there's nothing wrong with doing these things, but you can't take care of everybody. Speak loudly, dear.
I kind of have a random question. How are we supposed to explain to, like, for Haiti, for example, if we gave goods to the believers first, how are we supposed to explain to the non-believers sorry, we're going to give it to these people instead of...
Okay, if they are in front of your face,
Yeah.
sometimes you have to go ahead and do it. But you have to be careful how you do that. What if 8,000 people show up in front of your face and you've only got stuff to cover 500 people? What are you going to do? You can only do 500 people, right? So you basically have to say, we're out of stuff. You go. You know, we can't help you anymore. We don't have any more. But at the same time, you know, you don't have to go out and go, benevolence, 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 you know, come after we're done. You know, you take care of the people that are closest to you first, and then if you have excess, you spread it further. And quite often, we have excess, quite often. But we need, again, focus is on the believers, not exclusivity. We don't have to be exclusive to the believers. We just need to focus. Say what?
Somebody believes he's not believing. We do.
Yeah, if I run up on someone, well, these people that are asking me for money for food, as far as I know, they're not believers. They don't say anything that would suggest that. I help them anyway if I can. But if they ask me for $10,000, I'm probably not going to give it to them. Probably not. Okay. But some people are going to hate us because of our love. 1 John 3:11-14 talks about the loving that we need to give to one another and how Cain killed his brother because he hated him. And he says, because his own actions were evil and his brothers were righteous. He hated his brother because his brother was righteous. So do not be surprised, my brothers and sisters, if the world hates you for doing good. Don't be surprised. Yes?
And partial answer to the question that was asked, oftentimes that's an opportunity to teach people why we are brothers and sisters.
That's right. You can explain.
Christ and offer them an opportunity to become one.
Why didn't you give me money or food? Well, let me explain. Why? We have limited resources, and these are our brothers and sisters.
And they come first.
And the brothers and sisters come first. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's absolutely nothing, because somebody has to be excluded. Somebody, somewhere, is going to have to be excluded. Okay. By the way, we can't go away without saying what's in Acts 20:35. He says it's more blessed to give than to receive. So when you give benevolence, you get it back, even in a greater quantity. So, summary of what we've talked about. Do good wherever you can, which is just about always in our speech and our manner of life. We can do good in that all the time. I have to mention Ephesians 2:10. It says, for we are God's handiwork created in Christ Jesus to do good works, which God prepared in advance for us to do. Most of you know that that's my favorite verse in the whole Bible. We need to be especially attentive, remember what we talked about especially, to the physical, emotional, and spiritual needs of believers, while we also try to meet the needs, wherever we can, of unbelievers, but especially to believers. The result is that people will see how we love each other by our concern for each other and will be drawn or repelled by us. The ones who are repelled by us are not called to salvation. That term is used in the Bible repeatedly. They're just not called. They have no interest in salvation, and they will hate you. And as the opportunity and resources permit, we should help those who are not believers whenever we can, after we have helped the believers. And we will be blessed. So we're several minutes past. I apologize, but you've asked a lot more questions than I expected, and I loved them, and I would have ended exactly on time if you hadn't asked those questions. Go ahead. Okay.
The statement that Jesus made.
A statement that Jesus made, okay?
You will have the poor always.
You will always have the poor. In fact, remember the woman came in and she poured like a year's salary worth of perfume on him. And Jesus says, this could be sold and feed the poor. She says, you'll always have the poor with you. She's prepared you for burial. It was a good thing. And so even Jesus said, you're not going to get rid of the poor. You're just never going to get rid of it, ever. Do what you can, but she's doing something important here. Okay, those of you who are in my classes also know that I quite often do what I would call a benediction at the end of the class, and I'm going to do one tonight, and then I'll be done. May you do good to everyone wherever you have opportunity, but may you be extra, especially good and loving to those who do the will of our Father in heaven, through Christ our Lord.